How to Stop Them, which has just been published in German by Hoffmann and Campe under the title Bürgerkriege, warum immer mehr Staaten am Abgrund stehen. Here's the book, the German one, and also the American version, How Civil Wars Start. I can warmly recommend both of the books to you. It's worth reading. We have an hour discussion to speak about the book's thrilling and disturbing thesis. I will be your moderator and will ask the questions in our discussion. Each audience member is, of course, a participant in our discussion and is cordially invited to put their questions to Professor Walter via the F&A tool on the bottom of your screen. I will then give my best to incorporate them all into our conversation. So first, a few words about our guest, Professor Walter. She teaches international relations at the University of California in San Diego, is a member of the US Foreign Relations Council, and until recently was on the US government's political instability task force. She has been researching civil wars around the world for more than 3 decades, so she knows the subject like few others. And she has, like for many Americans, her roots in Europe, in Switzerland and Germany. Her father is from Bavaria, her mother from a small Swiss canton that only granted women the right to vote in 1991. So I suppose it must be Appenzell.
Yes,
Appenzell Innerrhoden, or
Jawohl.
Yes. Okay, my first question to her is, even after 2 years of quite successful work by the Biden administration, a much better than expected midterm election for the president and a peaceful one, do you still think that the US is on the brink of civil war? And what would be the signs that indicate this?
Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as on the brink of civil wars. I would say that it has the risk factors for civil war. And I would say in some ways it's no better today than it was on January 6, 2021, when we had the attack on the Capitol by Trump supporters on the far right. I breathed a sigh of relief when Joe Biden was elected. I think most Americans feel that the United States is more stable today and that our democracy is stronger. But in reality, that's not true. We are lucky that we have a person in power who honors the rule of law and who values democracy and is not going to do anything to try to unravel it. But the reality is, since Joe Biden has been president, he has not been able to enact a single reform of our political system. So America's democracy today is no stronger. And the reason that it is no stronger is that even when the Democrats controlled all the branches of power, controlled the House, controlled the Senate, controlled the White House, it did not have the votes to push through any reforms. It couldn't get rid of the filibuster. Well, it couldn't get rid of all of these undemocratic features that America's democracy has: the filibuster, gerrymandering, the crazy way that we run our elections and tally our votes. Nothing has changed. If the Republicans come into power in 2024, which they could, they have no interest in strengthening our democracy. In fact, they're going to take us in the opposite direction. They're probably going to take various suggestions from Orban's playbook. And the reason the Republicans don't want to strengthen our democracy is because the Republican Party in the United States today is essentially a white evangelical Christian party. And the United States is no longer a white evangelical Christian country. It's multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious. But if you want to maintain your whiteness and if you believe that America should remain a white Christian country, then a healthy democracy based on one person, one vote no longer serves you. And so Do I think we're on the brink of civil war? No, but we know what the risk factors are. One of those risk factors is a weak democracy, and the Republicans have no interest in strengthening it, and the Democrats have no ability to make it stronger.
Yes. You speak of when you speak of these risk factors, actually, and these causes or triggers of civil war, you mentioned some of them, and I have listed them. I think you are mentioning 5 of them, if I see it right, and that's I would say it's what you call inequity. I can't spell it right. I think inequity. Then the rise of factions, status loss, dying hope, and social media. So maybe we come first to inequity, which is something in between autocracy and democracy, the political situation. And my question with respect to this situation, whether the United States is still a democracy or something in between autocracy and democracy, why does this situation lead to civil war?
Yeah.
That's maybe the first part of my question, and the easy part. And second, don't we need to distinguish on the direction of the transition? I mean, it's easier for me to understand that civil war occurs when dictatorships collapse, because those in power have much, if not everything, to lose. But I have more trouble understanding why the slippage of democracy into this intermediate realm can also lead to civil war. In a democracy, especially a long-established democracy, there's actually no power group, or at least there should be no power group that has everything to lose. And the police and military should be subject to democratic control. So my question is, are there actual examples where a consolidated democracy has descended into civil war?
Oh, okay. I'm going to take that in order. There was a lot of material there. And actually, let me start with a little background to put this all in context for your listeners. Yeah. In 2017, I was invited to join this task force run by the US government through the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. It's called the Political Instability Task Force. It's been around since 1994. It still exists today. It's very active. The task force is comprised half of experts on political violence and civil war, people like me, and half of data analysts who basically take the information that the experts give them and come up with a predictive model that will help the US government predict which countries around the world are likely to unravel politically, which are likely to have regime change, political violence, and civil war. And when the model was first created, the data analysts asked the experts, tell us everything that you think might put a country at risk of civil war. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of very sophisticated academic studies over the last 30 years that have collected enormous amounts of data on every country in the world and every civil war around the world. And it turns out that there were about 38 different factors that the experts thought might lead a country on a path to civil war. Some of them were obvious, whether a country was poor, had high levels of poverty, high levels of income inequality, whether a country was ethnically and religiously diverse, but also things you wouldn't necessarily think of, whether a country had lots of difficult terrain, mountains, swamps, forests, things that would make it easy for rebel groups to hide. The data analysts went away, they took all this information, and when they came back, they said, we have a model that's highly predictive, and it relies on only 2 factors. And it wasn't the factors that the experts had expected. The first factor, and the most important one, was what you mentioned earlier, anocracy, Anocracy is just a fancy term for a government that has elements of democracy, it has elements of autocracy. And one of the things that we've learned is that full, healthy democracies, countries like Denmark, countries like Canada, don't almost never experience a civil war. But the opposite is true as well. Full autocracies, really repressive regimes, almost never experience civil wars. The violence happens in the middle. And so your first question was, why is that the case? We don't know exactly, but we see certain patterns and similarities across cases. One of the things that we see is that these partial democracies are also quite weak governments. And they're also governments that are often transitioning. They're moving from autocracy towards democracy. They're kind of slowly trying to build up their democratic institutions, or they're democracies that are going in the other direction and their institutions are under attack and are being dismantled. And what we think is happening is that every society has groups that are unhappy, and they have groups and individuals who are out of power, but they want to be in power. And when you have a government that's in transition and is in this middle zone and is weak, these individuals and these groups see an opportunity, and they see this as their window to try to grab power. And because the state is weak, it often doesn't have the ability to put them down. It also often doesn't have the ability to make the reforms that will make these groups more satisfied so that they don't think they have to turn to violence. And it turns out that the faster the transition, whether a country is trying desperately and rapidly to democratize. Think about what the United States tried to do in Iraq after we toppled Saddam Hussein. We tried to catapult it from a very authoritarian country to a very democratic country. And what we ended up doing is completely destabilizing and weakening the government to the point where every nefarious group in Iraq suddenly grabbed arms and tried to grab power. It can also happen in the other direction. You ask for an example. Ukraine, prior to 2014, was a country that had made it across that anocracy zone. They were considered a democracy. And then you had who is the leader? Who eventually fled and went to Crimea and then Moscow. He tried to concentrate power in his own hands. He dragged Ukraine back into the middle zone. You then started to have these massive protests, this instability. The protesters were actually successful in convincing him to leave. Elections were held, a new person came to power. But the supporters of that previous pro-Russian president, who most of whom live in eastern and southeastern Ukraine, they quickly took up arms because they saw that they were losing power in this fight. They did not want a pro-Western president in power. They were not going to benefit from those policies. And so you see
Ukraine is maybe a special case. I mean, there have been some passages in your book, I think, that have been cancelled in the German edition because of this. Yes, I mean the problems that are going with the fact to say that Ukraine is actually a civil war. I mean, we have a special situation here because of Russia and the interference by Russia and the dependency also of this president that you mentioned. I think Yanukovych was his name.
Oh, Yanukovych, yes.
Yes, and so, I mean, how do you distinguish between civil wars and wars where there is a foreign intervention into a country? I mean, that would be also a special situation for the United States. I mean, there it's hard to imagine that someone from outside, although We have spoken about Russian intervention during the elections, and also at the moment, I think they are still trying to intervene, but it's much harder than in Ukraine, for example.
Yeah. So Ukraine is no longer a civil war. That is officially an interstate war between Russia, the Russian forces and Ukrainian forces. That's a classic war between countries, but it did start out as a civil war. You had Ukrainian citizens. They were mostly ethnically Russian. Russian speakers who lived in Eastern Ukraine, who wanted either independence or they wanted actually to join Russia. That was a civil war. It had significant help from Russia, but one of the things that most people don't know is that most civil wars have fairly significant external intervention. And in fact, one of the big trends that we are seeing in this 21st century world is the increasing what we call internationalization of civil war. More and more countries are becoming involved when a civil war happens, either if it's in a neighboring country or even if it's in a different region. Think about the Syrian civil war, for example, how much external intervention there was from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, from the United States, from Russia. And those are just the big players. There were other smaller states that were involved as well. Do we still consider that a civil war? It is absolutely a civil war. But today, when a civil war breaks out, the government and rebel groups, they go looking outside their borders for help, and they often find it. What's different about Ukraine is that you had a civil war, and then you had a neighboring country attack that country to try to conquer it entirely. So you had a civil war, and then you had this very kind of old school war of conquest. And that's where we are today.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, these secessionist groups in Eastern Ukraine, I think they were from the beginning, they were supported by the Russian government.
Yes, they were. But again, that does not negate that it's a civil war. Oftentimes, nascent, wannabe rebel groups, they do not get off the ground. They are not able to grow unless they have the support of an external patron. And so most groups actively look for that, unless they're lucky enough, for example, to be sitting on deposits of diamonds, like UNITA was in Angola, or if they happen to be operating in an area where there's a lot of drug production, like you saw, for example, in Colombia. But for the most part, rebels need external financing if they want to sustain themselves.
Yeah. Okay, you have spoken also of this second condition of civil wars, which are factions or superfactions. And you mentioned that all the time in civil wars there are people or groups actually that feel that feel the loss of status or feel disillusioned by the government. We also have a question from the audience actually, where someone asked if that you write in your book about adapting democracy and government to the needs of people. And he asked, or she asked, but can a democracy actually cater to the needs of those disillusioned people who don't believe in democracy anymore, those hillbilly LED types?
Yeah.
These forgotten men and forgotten women, the Trump voters of 2016. This would be the superfaction in the United States, right?
Yeah. So there's two questions there. One is about the second factor. I kind of left everyone in suspense. Okay, there were two important factors. What's the second one? And then it's this question of what do you do if voters no longer believe in democracy, no longer trust in democracy? And let me start with that, and I'll go back to these ethnic factions. I think probably one of the biggest stories of our time is what Vladimir Putin has been doing in terms of his sustained and aggressive attacks via social media against Western liberal democracy. Every single country in Western Europe has been affected by this. The democracies of North America, Australia, and New Zealand, but it's most, but Putin has directed much of his attention to the countries, to the countries of Western Europe, the stalwart, powerful exemplars of democracy. And he's done this via disinformation campaigns. And it's something that most people don't know about. Starting in 2010, Vladimir Putin came up with this brilliant idea that his biggest threat to his survival as a leader of Russia was if democracies continued to thrive, if people in democracies continued to live high quality lives, Russians would eventually come to believe that they should have this as well. And if they came to believe this, they would no longer want Vladimir Putin in power. Now, Russia is actually quite a weak state, militarily, economically. It's very hard for a country like Russia to attack a country like Germany or the UK or France or the United States in any direct way. Russia will lose those battles. Whether it attacks it militarily or whether it attacks it economically, Russia simply cannot compete. And then social media came on the scene. And what Putin does understand and what he's very good at is propaganda. And he was one of the first leaders to realize the power of internet propaganda. And he realized that these democracies were giving him a backdoor way to undercut them and destabilize them. And so since 2010, he has skyscrapers filled with young people who are on social media 24 hours a day, who are figuring out what the divisive societal issues are in a country like Germany or in the United States. And he is pushing out disinformation and misinformation. And he's increasingly attacking people's beliefs and trust in democracy. And he has been increasingly successful. He had an aggressive campaign using social media in the United Kingdom to try to convince Brits that they shouldn't be in the EU anymore. And he used a variety of tactics and stories and narratives. And what do you know? Great Britain is no longer in the EU. And who's suffering as a result of that? It's the British. If you look at trust in democracy across all the countries, the younger generation has lower levels of trust than the older generation, and that trust has been declining, and it tends to coincide with the rise of social media. That's a huge, huge story. How do you rebuild trust in democracy once it's lost? Well, one of the things we certainly have to do is regulate social media, which we do not do in the United States. And the 5 biggest tech companies are all American companies. We should close that backdoor way for the enemies of democracy to sow distrust. And then to get back to the second factor, okay, we know that a big risk factor for civil war is whether a country's government is this sort of partial democracy. The second one is whether its political parties break down along ethnic, religious, or racial lines rather than any sort of political ideology. And I guess the best way that I can illustrate this is just to talk about what happened in the former Yugoslavia after the Cold War. This was a classic case where a country had these two factors. You had the collapse of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Yugoslavs were allowed to choose whatever government they wanted. They were very keen to create a democracy. They were keen to do this quickly. They rapidly set up competitive elections. They were real elections. And you suddenly had individuals like Slobodan Milosevic looking at this new this new environment that was emerging, and realize that he was in trouble. Slobodan Milosevic had been a communist in power during the Soviet era. He'd been a member of the Communist Party his whole career. And now he's facing democratic elections. He knew that Yugoslavs didn't like communists, and he knew that Yugoslavs knew that he was a communist. So he had this dilemma that he wanted to maintain power, but how do you do that if people in fact don't like you? And he was really smart and he was very strategic, and he realized that he did have one advantage. The largest ethnic group in Yugoslavia were the Serbs, and Slobodan Milosevic was ethnically Serb. And so he very quickly began to spout this narrative about how Serbs needed to stick together. Serbs needed to elect a Serb leader. It didn't matter whether you wanted a liberal, whether you were a capitalist or a communist, a conservative or liberal, none of that mattered. All that mattered was your ethnicity. And Milosevic basically argued that if you don't elect a Serb, a strong, powerful, nationalistic Serb, then the Croats are going to elect a strong, powerful, nationalist Croat. And if a Croat comes to power, they're going to throw the Serbs out of government, throw them out of the civil service, and eventually start killing them the way they did in World War II. And this turned out to be really, really effective. And Yugoslavs, even in places like Sarajevo, which had been really completely intermixed ethnically and religiously, Serbs started to gravitate into ethnically pure parties. And that's the second factor. So if you have a weak democracy that has political parties that are suddenly organized around identity and not some bigger issue that would cross racial, ethnic, religious lines, that's when you start to go down this path towards potential political violence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I do understand, I think, why Serbs and Croats, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, or Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq, or Hutu and Tutsi, another example from your book, are such superfactions, because they have a distinct cultural identity and also a history. But I have some problem to transfer this to the United States of America, because I mean, I have learned during my studies at the university that the United States is a special nation. I mean, it's a nation that is, yes, it's an idea actually. I mean, being the first new nation on earth, and being a country of immigrants and the refuge of the politically and religiously persecuted, who set out to bring freedom to the world and democracy, and also a country of tolerance and generosity, which leaves room for diversity of identities and cultures. So, I mean, who would be actually the superfaction in this diverse country where we have this phenomenon of the hyphenated American, the German American, the Swiss American, the Italian, Chinese, Korean, Mexican American, to name just a few. I mean, who would be the culturally distinct group in the United States to which a ruler like Milosevic, or we would say Trump, actually could cater to, or could.
Yeah. So one of the things that we also know from these numerous studies is we know who tends to start civil wars. And it's not the groups that most people think will start a war. Most people think it's going to be the poorest groups in society, or the groups that are most heavily discriminated, or immigrants. They focus on the groups that on the surface clearly have a lot of grievances towards the state and are not being treated well. Those groups don't tend to start civil wars, and they don't tend to start civil wars because they don't have the capacity to. They're often just desperately trying to survive, or the government is watching them very closely, and they have no attempt to organize. Blacks in the United States, if they ever took up arms, the local police forces would crack down on them much more aggressively than they would ever crack down on a group of white men who took up arms. That's been just the history of racial relations in the United States. The whole reason, this is a side story, but it's an interesting story. The whole reason the Southern Confederate States were able to have such a large army during America's first Civil War, an army that rivaled the government's army. The reason they had that army was because for decades prior to that, there were powerful militias operating all throughout the South that were well-trained, well-equipped. And the reason the South had powerful militias was they were there to ensure that there were no slave uprisings. So even if Blacks in the United States had ever wanted to rebel or fight violently, the civil rights movement was different. It was very, very peaceful, and Blacks who participated in that were very, very careful to remain peaceful because they understood what would happen to them if they became violent. The groups that tend to start civil wars are the groups that had once been politically dominant and are in decline, period. It's the once powerful groups that see that they are losing power. And oftentimes they're losing power because of demographic changes, because of in-migration, or because of a change in the birth rate. Lebanon experienced a civil war because Christians who had dominated politics, because they had been the majority, were losing that majority status because Muslims in Lebanon had a higher birth rate. The Muslims in southern Philippines, Southern Philippines was their territory. They had once been independent. They had once ruled this. They spoke their own language. They practiced their own religion. They had all the benefits of the dominant group. And then they became part of the Philippines. And then the Philippine government began to encourage Catholics from the north to settle there. And there was more and more in-migration, to the point where in most regions in Mindanao, Muslims are now a minority. They started the Civil War. So if you now take that and look at the United States and you ask yourself, is there a group in the United States that had once been dominant politically and economically, but is in decline? The answer is absolutely yes. It's whites, and it's white Christians. The United States will be majority non-white by about 2045. That's not that far away. And there's a subset of the white population who's deeply resentful of this, who's deeply threatened by this, and who truly believe that America is theirs, that America is a white Christian nation, should always be a white Christian nation, and it is their right to do anything possible to make sure it stays that way. And that's what you're seeing. That's what you saw on January 6th. That's what you're seeing with the Trump movement. That's what you're seeing with many of the mass killings that have been happening in the United States. It's an attempt by this group, and they have a slogan for it: we will not be replaced. Do we have an ethnic faction? The Republican Party today is absolutely an ethnic faction by the definition that the CIA uses on its own task force. The United States has two big parties. The Democrats are a grab bag of everybody: whites, Blacks, Asians, Latinos, Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists. They are all in one party. The Republican Party is almost 80% white and overwhelmingly evangelical Christian in a country that is not over 80% white and overwhelmingly evangelical Christian. And this is a recent phenomenon. Before Obama came to power, whites in this country were equally likely to be Democrats or Republicans. If you saw a white person on the street in America, you could flip a coin, to try to determine what party they were in. And that's not the case today. If you see a white person in America, it is more than likely that that person is a member of the Republican Party. It's that sort of ethnic faction.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I'm a little bit too naive or optimistic, I don't know, but I see it a little bit. I mean, this argument, there has been this book in the early 2000s about the emerging democratic majority by two political scientists, which argued, or at least were interpreted, that we will have a multiracial rainbow coalition, which will bring a lasting political majority for Democrats. And I mean,
we have that on the Democratic side. The Democratic Party is that. Yeah. The weird thing is that our second big party is not. It's almost like they do represent the two visions of America that exist. And I think we are in this battle right now of whose vision will prevail. Will it be the vision that you just outlined, which is, of course, what most Americans want? This multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious rainbow coalition, or are we going to double down and ensure that the way that the America of the 1950s or the 1850s continues? And I really do think that we're in a battle right now for the future of America. Which vision is going to be implemented? And there's a lot of us who are fighting for what we see as the inevitable multicultural America, and we're proud of that, and we see all the strengths associated with that. And then you have the Trump and the Republican Party and many white citizens who absolutely are fighting tooth and nail to prevent that. And of course, they want to prevent it in part because they're going to lose their privilege. They like all the privileges that they get from being white. And then
yes, but I would say this fight is also being fought out in the Republican Party, although certainly it is predominantly white and predominantly Trumpian, but there is still a faction in the Republican Party that is also open to this idea of a multiracial democracy, although it may be very small, but
reasonable moderates in the Republican Party have been fighting for that. They have been very clear to other leaders in the Republican Party that the party has to expand, that it has to, in particular, reach out to Latino voters. That's a clear constituency for them. it's not clear that Latinos really should be Democrats. They're much more socially conservative than the Democratic Party is. They could find a home in the Republican Party. The Republican Party wasn't so damn racist. But those
even then they are
individuals,
finding a home. See, if you look at Florida or so, there are many Latin Americans actually voting for.
yeah, I mean, Florida is a fascinating place because if you look at its Hispanic population, it has many different. It's an enormous variety of Hispanics, more so than any other state. Most other states in the United States, when you talk about Latinos, you're mostly talking about Mexicans. That's not true in Florida. When you're talking about Latinos in Florida, you're talking about Cubans who are very conservative. You're talking about Puerto Ricans who are different from Mexicans. So you're talking about a more complex demographic scene. And Cubans also are very wealthy for the most part on average, and politically powerful. So it's an interesting case in Florida. Now I've lost my train of thought. So,
but it's also, I mean, it's also on the Democratic side. If you look at the Democratic Party or if you look at white people, I mean, it's also not so homogeneous. Whites are also a heterogeneous population. The most progressives certainly are white people, well-educated people, well-settled people, economically well-treated. So, I mean, I think it's much more complex than this black and white picture. And maybe we have seen some important steps during the last 2 years, during the Biden administration, although he didn't was successful, as you have said, with political reforms, getting rid of the filibuster and all those electoral reforms, or the electoral college reform and so on. I mean, those are all political reforms which to me seems to be from the wish list of very progressive people. And maybe it would be more important actually also if we speak about the prevention of civil wars and the prevention of political conflict, to find solutions that are more moderate. And I mean, that was actually the case during the Biden administration, which was quite successful in important respects, I think. And it was maybe successful because, yes, maybe we have to thank Senator Joe Manchin or Senator Kirsten Sinema, which are actually seem to be enemies of the progressive side of the Democratic Party, that they actually were successful in moderating President Biden's agenda.
Yeah. So there's two sort of responses to that. The first is to get back to this interesting point you made about, well, you know, the white community is more varied than most people think as well. And that is absolutely true. And you had mentioned this term, and I use it in the book, superfactions. And superfactions are particularly dangerous. And the Republican Party is not only an ethnic faction because it's overwhelmingly white and evangelical Christian, but it's a super faction because it also breaks down along urban and rural lines. And so the big divide in the white community is really a geographic divide. And you'll hear MAGA Republicans talk about the coastal elites with disdain. They'll talk about people who live in California and New York with hatred. They're really talking about whites who live there. You know, most people have seen that's, you know, sort of that striking map of the United States that's mostly red and then pockets of blue. And this shows you where, you know, Republicans are and where liberals are. And liberals are all in the cities, the big cities, the urban areas, the suburban areas. Those have very, very big populations. They represent a majority of the US population. And then everything in between, which is very sparsely populated, that's Republican. And those are white Republicans for the most part. And what also distinguishes rural Americans from urban Americans, and this is a gross generalization, and of course it's not capturing everything, but the coastal people who live in cities tend to be wealthier. They tend to have a higher education, and so that's another big difference in the white community. So if you were to walk down the city in New York City and you were to see a well-dressed white woman, professional woman, I would probably guess she's a Democrat and not a Republican. And that is the key divide, I think, here in the white population. And then your second question was, Biden's policies. Did the progressives moderate? Did Sinema and Manchin do America a favor? We need real political reform. Our democracy is very, very vulnerable to backsliding in a way that Germany's democracy is not. We know the area, like if Viktor Orban were to run for president in the United States and he were to win, there's very, very clear vulnerabilities, and he knows about them, and Donald Trump knows about them, and those in America who want America to become less democratic, they know about it, and they're going to exploit those. We need to fix that, and the filibuster is one of them. Gerrymandering is another one. Big money in politics, which Germany doesn't have, that's another one. But what Biden has done, as you said, which I think is going to pay dividends, is he passed the big infrastructure bill, which in many ways is going to put money in the hands of working class Americans, and especially the white working class. And Donald Trump, one of the big changes that happened in American politics was that the white working class, who had historically voted Democrat, they're the party of labor. They're the party of an economic and social safety net. Those white working class voters moved to the Republican Party when Obama was elected, and that was puzzling. But it really helped to get Donald Trump elected. And the reason they moved was because the Democrats under Bill Clinton, when they passed the North American Free Trade Act, it was presented to Americans as this is going to be good for all Americans. Free trade brings prosperity. A rising tide will lift all boats. And the reality is that that's never true. In any free trade agreement, there's always winners and losers. And everybody who studied this, including the Democrats, understood that the big losers of this free trade agreement was going to be those who worked in manufacturing, the car companies, the textile mills here in the United States. And those manufacturing jobs were held by white men, and those jobs brought them solidly into the middle class. They were stable, they were well-paying, they allowed the white working class to build houses and send their kids to college, all of those good things that lead to a stable society. And when manufacturing jobs left the United States, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, nobody took any measures to protect that group. And that group has been declining on every measure: divorce rates, suicide rates, alcoholism, the lifespan. The lifespan of Americans, especially white male Americans, has declined. And it's that group that essentially was disproportionately affected by this big free trade agreement.
but I mean, there have been some changes under Trump, and I mean, and Biden followed Trump in this respect, at least with respect to protectionist trade policies and buy American policies and so on. So maybe there is something underway which can give these groups hope again that they are not always
I think
on the losing side. I mean,
yeah, that's what Trump, that's what Trump and Biden would like to do it. You know, I think it's smart politics. The question is it too little, too late?
Yeah. Okay, so you would prefer actually to have more political reforms, strengthening democracy, and these independent commissions in order to draw electoral boundaries, and the reinstatement of the Voting Rights Act and so on, automatic voter registration.
Yeah.
You have listed, and campaign finance reform. But I mean, aren't these reforms actually unrealistic politically? I mean, you have also said we would need actually a reform of the two-party system and of the majority electoral system. I mean, these proportional representation would be better actually in order to prevent civil war. Wherever we have civil wars, it's mostly in countries with majoritarian electoral systems. I mean, that's actually a big step, and it's quite impossible in the United States to reform these institutions, isn't it?
Yeah, so we have a saying here in the United States, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. In an ideal world, of course, we would want to fix every little thing that's wrong with America's democracy. If that's your aim, you're never gonna get there. So you want to pick and choose. The single easiest to implement change that we could make is simply to make voting easier. That's it. There's 100 little ways in which it's hard to vote here in the United States. But if we had automatic registration when you hit 18, it just automatically happened so that you didn't actually have to.
But I mean, your solution is the fear of those forgotten men and women. They don't want actually to expand voting. They want to restrict voting. Exactly. So your solution is, out of their view, actually makes it all worse.
Oh, well.
I mean, the Republican Party is actually trying to suppress the vote, and whereas Democrats, since a long time ago, actually try to expand voting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a central political conflict between these two parties. And what you have said of the great replacement, the theory, which is heavily, influential in militias and in the right-wing extremist groups. I mean, they are actually fearing that they will be overpowered by those minorities.
Yes.
Which will be someday a majority. Mm-hmm. And if you give them the right to vote, then they have no hope.
And that is true. But that subset of the population, that far right that wants to grab power, and they'll grab at any means that they can, they will only be successful if the leadership actually goes along with them. And right now, the Republican Party not only is going along with them, but is captured by that far right. The reason that the leadership is going along with that minority of Americans is because most Americans don't vote. It is not unusual for midterm elections to have a 20% turnout of eligible voters. So 80% of eligible voters in many of our midterm elections are sitting on the sidelines. So if you could make voting easier, if you could do a whole series of things to entice that 80% to go out to vote, we would have a completely different set of individuals in Congress. We would not have the extremists that we do now. We would have probably more moderate individuals in the House and in the Senate. And they wouldn't have to cater to the extreme on the far right or the far left, because it tends to be the more extreme voters today who turn out for midterm elections. And so voting, just getting a higher percentage of your average American to go out to vote, would have this ripple effect that would make it much harder for the extremists to capture our government.
Mm-hmm. But turnout has increased under, since Obama and then under Trump, we had 50% in the 2018 midterm elections and 45 or 46, I think, in this midterms.
Yeah. And it was consequential. Yeah, it was important.
Yeah. So, and if we make it easier to vote, okay, if people then vote actually is another issue, maybe. But,
yeah. Yeah, and this last midterm was you saw the power of turnout. In a normal midterm election, we would have had what they call a red wave. If you have a Democratic president in power, the opposing party tends to make enormous gains in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. That's especially true if you're in a period of an economic downturn, which the United States is. We had high inflation. We had a whole series of things that economically should have convinced many Americans to vote for the Republican Party. And the fact that we had higher turnout, most of those people who were turning out were voting for the Democrats. And so we had a very unusual outcome where the Republicans made some gains, but really not much. They have a very, very slim majority in the House of Representatives, and they were not able to capture the Senate. This is really quite surprising. And we didn't even have 50% turnout. Imagine if we had double that, what the effects could have been.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think we've already spoken about an hour. I see we have 8:30 now at the moment, so we have come to a conclusion or so. Unfortunately, we were not able to cover many of the topics you have addressed in your book, and I think an hour is definitely too short for that. Nevertheless, I hope that we were able to get a good impression of your book, and that the listeners to our conversation, that they absolutely have to read it. It really has a lot of exciting stories to tell. And I think the parallels that can be drawn between Civil War histories around the world and the current situation in the US are really striking and eye-opening. May the book and the discussions of its thesis help prevent the outbreak of civil war or terrorist attacks in the United States. I think in the last 2 years, there have been important steps taken along this path, but there's still a great deal to be done, and there remains the need to be vigilant. So thank you very much, Professor Walter, for this lively and enlightening conversation, and have a good day. Or for us here in Germany, a good evening.